I thought it would be really funny to introduce a European myth like the werewolves into Australia. Well, the logical thing to do was to make a werewolf a marsupial, especially since there was a Tasmanian tiger, and the fact that it was extinct made it even better. I found that I've always loved that piece of film, the last piece of film, sadly, of the Tasmanian tiger. It's an incredible piece of newsreel footage. We see it opens its jaws 180 degrees. I thought, this is fantastic. I'll just work this into a Howling movie, because I just made Howling II, which was a conventional, Transylvania werewolves and gypsies with Christopher Lee, which we'd shot behind the Iron Curtain. That's another story. So I just thought that was a funny idea, to have marsupial werewolves. Well, I don't know how you would describe the faces on some of at that time, the government film executives when I said, I've got this great idea, marsupial werewolves. Well, that was greeted like, I don't know, we're going to do it was just, forget it. However, I went to a bank in Sydney, and they said, well, what did Howling II make? I said, well, the DVD alone sold $6 million. And they said, well, how much can you make Howling III for? I said, $1 million. And they said, here's the money. So we made Howling III for $1 million, and it was a hugely successful worldwide. It still is on DVD. It's everywhere. I felt that the Marsupials was using Hollywood instead of Hollywood using us, because we were using a Hollywood genre, an established one, and turning it into an Australian comedy, really, about marsupials, about things unique to Australia. And it was just fun. I mean, I love genre films, but I also like turning them on the head. I enjoy it. It makes it more interesting for me. I mean, one thing about this worth mentioning is that if film takes at least a year to make, and so I like, maybe to my detriment, sometimes making things a bit strange or peculiar or bizarre or eccentric or whatever, unusual. It makes it more interesting for me. I mean, it's really boring to make the same film again and again and again. Some directors keep making the same film. I don't know how they do it. Imogen Ainsley played Jerboa, who's the werewolf girl who comes from the outback to Sydney. And an interesting footnote is that the runner-up for the role was Nicole Kidman. And I can't remember exactly why I didn't cast Nicole, but I think it was she just wasn't werewolf enough for me. There wasn't that werewolf tang we needed. The movie sends up genre films, and particularly low-budget films, and there are two other films mentioned in the film. One is Shapeshifters Part 8, and the other is It Came from Uranus. I loved the idea in the first Howling, which I'd read about. I didn't actually see the first Howling. I didn't want to. I thought it might steer me in the wrong direction, because I'd decided the way to do a sequel was to ignore the previous ones to make it interesting. But what I read was that a newscaster turned into a werewolf. And I thought that was a really interesting idea, having people transform in strange situations. So I put in as many strange situations as I could in Howling 3. My favorite is the ballerina dancing in the Sydney Opera House turning into a werewolf in the middle of a spin. And the nun thing was the same thing. I just thought it was a funny idea, having nuns turn into werewolves. Look, there's a lot of ridiculous things in that movie, and they're supposed to be ridiculous. And the werewolf head bursting out was supposed to be a reference to Alien, the first Alien. More amusing to me in retrospect is when we had the marsupial birth. I studied some really boring Film Australia documentaries on kangaroos being born, and I noticed the whole little thing crawls up and goes in the... And I was trying to figure out how to do that with Bob McCarron, and Bob McCarron said, well, why don't we put a mouse in a werewolf fetus suit? I said, good idea. So we got this mouse, and we put a werewolf suit on it, fetus suit, and we put it on Imogen. Well, it's just started. Imogen started screaming, and it was running all around. And Bob said, "Well, we'll have to sedate the mouse." So I said, "Okay." So we got the nurse came with some, I don't know what she used. She injected the poor mouse inside the werewolf suit with this sedative, and it dropped dead. So look, use less sedative. She said, "I'm really sorry." So had to get another mouse, used a little bit of the sedative, and then I used the old Mad Dog reverse motion thing. It was impossible getting the mouse into the pouch. So we put the mouse in the pouch, filmed it in reverse, and of course it came out. So all was well. At one point I said we should call this movie, because it's about marsupials, A Womb with a View, or Tongue in Pouch. The crew really liked this movie because it was a challenge, because we were going to shoot it in 4 weeks. So everyone liked that idea. And, one of the things I've realized is that crews like working fast. It's really boring waiting for actors. It's all that stuff. In fact, actors like working fast. It's boring waiting. So it was a technical feat, if you like, to shoot that film in, I don't think it was 24 days or something, maybe less. It got a theatrical release, to the puzzlement of many, but those were the days when you premiered your film to get reviews theatrically, to promote the VHS. And the video did tremendously well. It sold something like, as I recall, 120,000 VHSs, which translated then to like $5 to $6 million cash. The New York Times said, if you see one werewolf movie, see this one. Actually, that is the best review I've ever had from the New York Times. It's mind-bending to me that people would think that we were seriously doing a movie about marsupial women, let alone marsupial werewolves. And to treat that as if it was some serious... I don't know, the mind boggles. But I think the issue is there is a conceptual problem for some people with parody send-up cartoon. To me, it's obvious. I mean, I've always loved those kinds of movies. The masterpiece, of course, is Dr. Strangelove, which is the ultimate satirical movie. There's always a tension between government and culture, because basically artists don't respond well in any literature, film, acting, music. Artists don't really respond well to being told what to do, because part of being an artist is to push the envelope a bit. And usually the government or the corporation is very conservative, which is not necessarily what the audience want to see, by the way. They're green-lighting movies that they think the audience want to see because it's what they want to see. That's not necessarily the case. That's why a lot of so-called out-there movies are huge successes, because the audience is dying for something fresh. So were the filmmakers tailoring their scripts to fit into some, to be perhaps a little bit too mean about it, mediocre ideas to get money? Yeah, they were. They were. Some great things slipped through. Sometimes it all works, but I don't think... I mean, governments have never been known as being great filmmakers. Orson Welles said that anyone can make a movie. A government can, a corporation can, an accountant can, a producer can, an actor can, a writer can, a cook can, a lawyer can. But historically, the fact is, directors, the best movies are made when the director's in control of the film. And that is just an historical fact. And so there's always tension in that. And in Australia, that was a big problem, because the government the government was biased towards producers, not directors. They're biased towards, so everything was producer. And I don't think that was particularly a fertile way to go. I don't think Australians had much of a chance to embrace Aussie genre pictures. There were not a huge amount of them. They were trashed in the press. I don't know why. It may have come from the government. It may have come from the government film bodies that they didn't want this kind of movie being made. They wanted masterpiece theatre kind of movies. They wanted merchant ivory kind of movies. But now you can see things break out with those guys who made Saw in Melbourne. I think there's a whole undertow in Australia of kids going to movies, movie buffs, who are going, well, you know, masterpiece theatre and merchant ivory is bloody boring. I'd like to see some action, you know, and that, why not? And so that was a very healthy thing. I think there's been a party line in film history which emanates from the film funding bodies about the lack of quality or irrelevance, let's say, of genre films. And I think the party line was because these weren't the films that they were funding. They didn't like them. They didn't understand them. They wanted to do, as I mentioned, merchant ivory kind of movies. And this party line was promulgated by the cultural bodies as well as the funding bodies. So the AFC and so on, people would do studies on the film industry. And a lot of these writers are funded by the government. It's hard to make a living as a writer. So there are very few independent film writers or critics or writers on film in Australia. So it's an untapped treasure trove of really interesting movies, and they're unpretentious, and they've got a lot of visceral energy, and they're entertaining. And at the end of the day, that's what it's all about.
Howling III, well, there was a film and a half. I remember meeting Philippe for the very first time. He rang me up, told me about this script, asked me to meet him at a restaurant. And he had this smile. You know, he's always smiling, Philippe. He's got a smile, a bit like Jack Nicholson as the Joker. It always comes up to about here. And I used to watch him when we worked on Howling III, and he'd have this smile, and he'd look at me, and even today, I'm still not sure if this smile is sort of tongue-in-cheek smile, that he really knows what's going on, and he's happy that we're all fooled into believing that, you know, we're working on a great film. He had that look all the time. You know, I don't know how I ever got roped into it. I think they made me an associate producer. I think they promised me some points on the film. I never got any money for it. But my budget, I remember, was $80,000, which was a lot of money in those days. But even so, it still didn't buy much. And we're talking about werewolves, and we're talking about hair suits. And these hair suits were hand knotted one at a time. Now, the average wig, even going back at that time, the average wig was costing about $2,000 to have made. Now, when you start thinking about the size of a wig and think about a whole werewolf suit and think about half a dozen werewolf suits and think about $80,000, you don't have much money. When Philippe gave me the script and I started seeing things like nuns looking like werewolves and marsupial werewolves and a baby werewolf coming out of a woman's vagina and climbing into her pouch, I'd look at him and he'd have this silly grin on his face. And I think I was led into it. I just thought, wow, this is going to be a fun film. And it was. I remember setting up the workshop. I mean, what makeup artists, especially in that time, would say no to a film that had so many crazy characters, and I've spoken to the actors even recently, one of the actors that played the nun, and she has such great memories of looking like a werewolf dressed as a nun. She had a great time. A lot of times people say to me, oh, Bob, why did you make that in the film? Why? And I have to say, like any film, you can lead a director sometimes to what should be done. Sometimes in their mind, the director wants a certain look. I remember in the scene, for instance, with Imogen, where she's lying in bed, she has this dream sequence. Well, Imogen, she was only like a 20-year-old young actress at that time. And I've worked with her a lot since then. And we got very close, and when I say close, we got close as a makeup artist and friend, but I was always lying on top of her with dummies and sitting between her legs and pushing things up between her legs. So there was a scene, of course, where she's lying in bed having this dream and something comes through her pouch. I remember sitting underneath the bed, Imogen's lying on top, lying down, and up through her pouch comes this horrible little head. And I don't know quite why Philippe wanted that little head. I don't even know where it was invented or whose idea, but it was this terrible little head and a scrawny neck. But he loved it. He wanted it to look crazy, look like a joke. He was pretty sort of straight on of surprising the audience. It didn't matter what you would do. He'd say, oh, well, why don't we just do that, Bob? That'd be fun. Working on films like Howling III, you know, I had a lot of fun. The crew have a lot of fun. It's because we all knew, I mean, you can't call it crap because it was good crap, but everybody knew. I remember, you know, I'd be sort of getting a werewolf ready on set, and the DOP had come up and did a light reading and sort of wink at me, and we knew everything was a joke. You know, we'd have werewolves, you know, sort of in an Aboriginal fireplace, you know, and the werewolf would spring up in a skeleton, and everyone would laugh and joke, and we were having a great time. It was a nice, easy flow film. We all knew it was rubbish, but good rubbish. Frank Thring, you know, what a character, you know, standing, you know, sort of waving the flag for Ben-Hur, and the next minute being on the set for the Howling III. I've got a head cast of his, and it's the biggest head I've ever moulded. It's enormous. And he didn't change. You know, he knew Philippe quite well, and sort of regarded him as sort of a young boy, and so would pat Philippe on the head quite now and again. But he took it very seriously, but he knew what the film was about. He was quite happy working on it. You know, it's a shame, you know, I was around, or still am around, but I was around when all these great films, this sort of genre was being made, you know, and we got to the 80s, and then it all changed, and people got serious. And it's only now, recently, that this sort of film is coming back. Australians, you know, we're a funny bunch. We don't seem to like making this sort of film. I think there's still, and I'll probably get shot down for this, but there's still a lot of people in Australia that would like to make the artistic film. Whether it makes any money, it doesn't worry them, but they want to make a true film that's got meaning and a message. And yet, talk to the film crew, and we love making B-grade horrors. Number one, it puts seats on bums, it pays for us, we have a great time making them, and it's fun. And audiences need to go and see these films. They like to have a laugh. I used to get really sick and tired of getting this sort of backlash about, you know, why are we making this sort of film in Australia? And we haven't got enough money anyway, and we're only doing sort of B grade films. Leave them to the Americans, they make them better than us. You know, and I think that's crap. I think, I mean, we had, if you start looking at all the films that we made, we had the top DOPs. I mean, every famous DOP now that's out winning Academy Awards shot these films. And some of the best production designers that are working around the world, some of the top stuntmen, you know, we've all sort of, you know, grew and sort of learnt our trade on these films. And it's a way of bringing a film crew in, a new film crew, young people, and get them trained. And they have a lot of good time making them.